Russia isn't known for inventing new things. The Russian government's story about fascists and Nazis ruling in Ukraine is nothing new either. They've been using the same old narratives for decades, going all the way back to the 1950s and even earlier. While sending tanks to Budapest in 1956 and to Prague in 1968, they claimed they were fighting fascists. When it comes to Russia's warfare tactics, the destruction of Ukrainian cities and towns we're seeing now isn't new either. We've seen it before in places like Grozny in Chechnya and more recently Aleppo in Syria.
The same applies to the Kremlin's geopolitical designs. Moscow's reliance on separatism and pseudo-republics can be traced back to at least the Finnish War of 1939-1940, but it became particularly pronounced during the fall of the Soviet Union. The Kremlin enacted the same scenario in Moldova and in Georgia in the early 1990s, and then, much later, tried to apply the same model in Ukraine. As the latter happened relatively recently, it allows us to examine and analyze the model in detail and to see to which extent it's a repetition of the things tried and tested. So in this video, we will talk about the model and its consequences. We'll use documents, international court decisions, archival interviews and documentaries, as well as our own interviews. We talked about the so-called Transnistria with a member of the Moldovan parliament, about Abkhazia and South Ossetia with a Georgian political scientist and former Minister of Education, and about the so-called LPR and DPR with the Ukrainian journalist and co-author of the book How Ukraine Lost the Donbas. We'll start with the 1990s, but if you're familiar with the situation in Ukraine in 2014, get ready for some serious déjà vu feelings.
On March 15, 2022, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe officially recognized Transnistria as a territory occupied by Russia. This decision was made in response to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine that had begun weeks before. However, there were grounds for such a recognition much earlier. The European Court of Human Rights had already established that the Transnistrian Moldovan Republic is entirely a creation of Russia way back in 2004. And since then, the ECHR has consistently upheld this position in its judgments. Here's an example. The Russian Federation had contributed both militarily and politically to the creation of a separatist regime in the Transnistrian region. The PMR was able to continue to exist only due to military, economic and political support from Russia. But how did it all begin?
The modern history of what is now known as the Transnistrian Moldovan Republic can be traced back to the pre-World War II era, when a Moldavian autonomy was formed as part of the Ukrainian SSR on the left bank of the Dniester River. In 1940, Stalin annexed parts of Romanian territory on the right side of the Dniester River, and that is how the Moldavian SSR was formed. To consolidate its power there not only administratively but also ideologically, the Kremlin fueled anti-Romanian sentiments, and when the USSR started to collapse, the Kremlin stoked those sentiments to an even greater extent.
Союзный центр пошел по пути провоцирования сепаратистских энклавов для того, чтобы удержать Молдову под контролем. Жители левого берега были доведены до такого коллективной шизофрении с эсхатологическими ожиданиями, когда матери готовы были послать своих сыновей убивать и умирать, лишь бы не проснуться на второй день в другом государстве. Имелось в виду страх перед объединением с Румынией.
In June 1990, Moldova declared its sovereignty. In response, the so-called Congress of Deputies of all levels in Tiraspol proclaimed the creation of the Transnistrian Moldovan Soviet Socialist Republic within the USSR in September of the same year. The then president of the USSR, Mikhail Gorbachev, did not officially support this new entity. However, there is evidence to suggest that the future PMR was oriented towards other individuals in Moscow.
Лидер самопровозглашенной Приднестровской республики Игорь Смирнов проводит интенсивные консультации с тогдашним министром обороны Советского Союза Дмитрием Язовым и председателем КГБ Владимиром Крючковым.
Igor Smirnov, who later became the first president of the so-called PMR, does not reveal any names, but he has confirmed that he had such contacts, particularly in a 2022 propaganda film.
Мысль одну нам подал тогда один из руководителей, сказал: то, что сами сумеете, засчитаю ваше.
Local propaganda likes to tell the story about how the residents of the left bank of the Dniester actually defended something on their own. But this is not the case. After both Moldova and the so-called PMR declared independence and the war broke out, very different groups of Russians rushed to defend the Transnistrian independence, ranging from Cossack volunteers to quite regular troops.
The involvement of Cossacks from Rostov, Kuban and other regions of Russia in the so-called defense of the so-called Transnistria is openly discussed in a documentary that was released in Russia during the 1990s. The documentary includes comments from the Cossacks themselves.
Сколько можно русский народ топтать? А ведь здесь в Приднестровье топчется русский народ. И мы пришли, вот вы спросили, до каких пор будут казаки здесь стоять. До конца. До конца.
Groups of Russian Cossacks would later, in more than 20 years, appear in Ukraine, allegedly to defend the so-called DPR and LPR. This is not the only similarity between the events on the left bank of the Dniester and in Ukraine. In particular, Igor Girkin, who played a key role in the beginning of the armed conflict in the Donbas in 2014, then fought on the PMR side. We will return to him later. And here a Moldovan historian relates who else fought for the PMR in the early 1990s.
Преступников, которые, значит, должны были сидеть в тюрьмах, не знаю, там, пожизненно, или были приговорены к расстрелу, их, значит, отправляли сюда, их освобождали и говорили: езжайте в Приднестровье, там вас вооружат.
Today, 30 years later, the Wagner PMC recruits prisoners to fight in Ukraine. But in the early days of the conflict in Transnistria, it was the 14th Army of the Russian Federation that played the main role. At the time of the collapse of the USSR, the 14th Army was stationed on the left bank of the Dniester. Even the propaganda films of the self-proclaimed Transnistria today recognize the involvement of Russian military personnel transferred to the jurisdiction of the PMR.
Саперный батальон под командованием полковника Игоря Дудкевича перешел под юрисдикцию Приднестровья.
The decisions of the European Court of Human Rights have consistently stated that the Russian 14th Army armed residents of the left bank of the Dniester. However, some interventions took place without any cover, directly, and this was acknowledged by Russian officials. In fact, in the same propaganda film, the former vice president of the Russian Federation talked openly about this decision.
Я применил норму Организации Объединенных Наций. Эта норма называется принуждение к миру. А другого выхода в этой ситуации просто не было.
Of course, Russia had no United Nations mandate to intervene in Moldova, just as it had no mandate to intervene in Georgia in 2008, when Russians used the exact same language to justify their invasion, calling it peace enforcement.
Мы применяем тактику принуждения к миру в соответствии с уставом Организации Объединенных Наций.
General Alexander Lebed, who arrived in Tiraspol, the so-called capital of the PMR, to implement the enforcement, delivered a speech filled with traditional Kremlin propaganda clichés about fascism and genocide.
Здесь имеет место геноцид, развернутый против собственного народа.
Russians would later repeat those propaganda clichés in relation to both Georgia and Ukraine. They have taken root well in Transnistria. For example, almost 20 years later, Igor Smirnov repeated them in a speech.
Создание нового государства многонациональным приднестровским народом было защитной реакцией против национал-фашистской политики, отстоявшим свою республику и защитившим приднестровский народ от геноцида. Слава героическому народу Приднестровья!
Today, this claim is still in vogue. For example, in the same Transnistrian movie from 2022.
Я должен сказать, что происходил в Дубасарах когда начались боевые действия, а впоследствии и в Бендерах, практически геноцид народа Приднестровья.
The army of the Republic of Moldova, which tried to regain control of the territories, could not compete with the Russian army. The Russian Federation took full control of the PMR, militarily, politically, and economically. But Moscow is nowhere near fulfilling the hopes of the locals for reunification. In 2006, a so-called referendum was even held on the left bank of the Dniester River, in which the locals voted for independence with subsequent accession to the Russian Federation, according to the so-called official results. Yet Russia has not even recognized the independence of its own creation. Meanwhile, the so-called Transnistria remains a zone of economic and social decline, characterized by rampant smuggling, a quasi-oligarchic holding of commercial companies called Sharif, and a widespread desire to leave.
На левом берегу Днестра жило 750 тысяч человек. Сейчас меньше половины. Люди говорят, которые кое-что знают про левый берег. То есть это депрессивный регион, из которого уехала активная молодежь. Там остались пенсионеры, люди в воинской униформе и шериф. Это бандитский режим, который существует до тех пор, пока через него можно извлекать деньги.
In the early 1990s, propaganda promised a different outcome for the people living on the left bank of the Dniester, as a significant part of Moldova's industry was concentrated in that region. We will not feed Moldova, we'll prosper ourselves, they said at the time. Instead, they witnessed decline. A similar fate befell Donbas, which, according to Russian propaganda, fed the entire Ukraine. But before we delve deeper into Ukraine's experience, let's first examine Georgia's experience. The self-proclaimed pseudo-republics of Abkhazia and South Ossetia on the territory of Georgia in the early 1990s are quite distinct from each other, both in their history and even in their declared goals. South Ossetia wants to join Russia, while Abkhazia declares its desire for separate independence. Although in the case of Abkhazia, that wasn't always the case. Here is what the Abkhaz leader said in 1993.
Мы от имени Верховного Совета Абхазии направили свое обращение в Верховный Совет России, в котором ставится вопрос о принятии Абхазии под покровительство или в состав Российской Федерации.
In fact, the Russian Federation is the common denominator between Abkhazia and South Ossetia, as both of these regions exist thanks to the support of the Russian Federation. This is similar to the case of the PMR and is also reflected in the conclusions of the European Court of Human Rights. Both regions were totally dependent on the Russian Federation not only in economic and financial terms, but also in political and military terms, including in relation to border protection. Just as in the case of the left bank of the Dniester in Moldova, the Kremlin supported separatist movements in Abkhazia and South Ossetia during the days of the collapse of the Soviet Union. The logic behind this support is similar in both cases.
Национально-освободительные движения, такие как в том числе в Грузии, они были врагами, противниками, источником опасности, но уже у режима не было как бы ресурсов для того, чтобы их просто так раздавить. И поэтому была политика поддерживать, скажем, различные контрдвижения против вот этих национально-освободительных движений. Союзником Кремля стали вот движения, скажем, в этих автономных двух областях, в Абхазии и Южной Осетии.
As in Moldova, this support resulted in an armed confrontation in Georgia. And just as in Moldova, the Russian military actively fought on the side of the separatists in Georgia. This is documented, for example, in a 1995 report by Human Rights Watch on the conflict in Abkhazia. Russian arms found their way into Abkhaz hands. Russian planes bombed civilian targets in Georgian-controlled territory. Russian military vessels, manned by supporters of the Abkhaz side, were made available to shell Georgian-held Sukhumi, and at least a handful of Russian-trained and Russian-paid fighters defended Abkhaz territory in Tkvacheli.
Российские там офицеры и так далее, они воевали, их убивали, там иногда брали в плен, но они Ну, официальная версия была такая, что вот они в отпуске, и они, находясь в отпуске, как добровольцы, воюют вот на стороне абхазов.
More than 20 years later, the Russian military often fought against Ukraine in Donbas under the same pretext. The style of the Russian efforts to conceal their participation in the fighting has remained consistent.
Я помню, что я могу вспомнить там эпизод, когда еще Сухуми был под грузинским контролем, и его бомбили российские самолеты с опознавательными знаками российскими. Ну, это как бы было очевидно. Ну, тогда Грачев, министр обороны тогдашний Российской Федерации, сказал, что это грузины перекрасили свои самолеты, так сказать, пририсовали российские там знаки, символику, чтобы потом обвинить Россию.
The propaganda used by the Russian media was similar in all these cases. They accused the first president of Georgia, Zviad Gamsakhuria, of radical nationalism and even fascism. In particular, he was falsely attributed with the phrase "Georgia for Georgians." During his first official visit to Moscow as president in 1991, Gamsakhuria personally denied and refuted these false claims.
А вот как бы вы прокомментировали ваше высказывание «Грузия для грузин»?
Между прочим, такого высказывания никогда не было. Это, как ни странно, это бытует уже. Вот. Это указывает на вот большую силу аппарата дезинформации, центра, который действует.
Gamsakhuria referred to Moscow as the center at the time when the USSR has not yet officially collapsed. In the same interview, the Georgian president directly accused Russians of waging an information war against Georgia.
Как центр относится к событиям Грузии, так и относится к средствам массовой информации. Они ведут информационную войну против Грузии. Это настоящая война, то, что они делают.
Despite Gamsakhuria's refutation, the false claim about the phrase Georgia for Georgians remained on the lips of Russians. In 2008, 15 years after Gamsakhuria's death, it was used by the then official president of the Russian Federation, Dmitry Medvedev, in a speech on the occasion of Russia's recognition of the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia.
В 1991 году президент Грузии Гамсахурдия с призывом «Грузия для грузин», только вдумайтесь в эти слова, приказал штурмовать Сухум-Цхинвал.
It's clear why the Russian government continues to hold a grudge against Georgia's first president, as he not only disputed their disinformation and accused them of information warfare, but also publicly blamed Russia for fueling the conflicts in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. For example, in a TV interview with Soviet officers in 1990.
Поощряется темными силами, так сказать.
А какими темными?
Ну, это, я бы сказал, ну, из метрополии, имперские темные силы это поощряют, чтобы вызвать вот эти национальные конфликты и этим парализовать национальное движение.
All of this was accompanied by typical narratives about fascism, which sometimes even got out of the Kremlin's control. In March 1991, the leaders of Georgia and Russia, Gamsakhuria and Yeltsin, decided to sign an agreement on a joint settlement of the conflict in South Ossetia. However, the Russian newspaper Kommersant reported that this agreement was met with resistance in the South Ossetian capital of Tskhinvali. The reaction to the agreement was immediate. On March 26, a rally was held in Tskhinvali under the slogan "Shame on Yeltsin for colluding with Georgian fascists."
The conflicts in Abkhazia and South Ossetia were eventually frozen through treaties with Moscow and the official deployment of Russian troops as peacekeepers. But although Abkhazia and South Ossetia declared their independencies in the early 1990s, they are obviously hardly independent, for the reasons already mentioned in this video and for several others. For example, the European Court of Human Rights also made the following observation.
Another aspect of creeping annexation was the fact that the separatist governments and security forces were manned by Russian officials. Russia appointed its former civilian and military leaders to serve in key posts in Abkhazia and especially in South Ossetia, including the de facto defense ministers of Abkhazia, Sultan Sosnaliyev, and South Ossetia, Anatoly Barankevich, and the de facto chief of the Abkhaz General Staff, Lieutenant General Gennady Zaitsev.
This is also part of the model used by Russia, and this was later observed in the so-called DPR and LPR. But to wrap up the story of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, it has to be said that, as it was the case in the Transnistrian Moldovan Republic, Russia was in no hurry to recognize their independencies. It did not happen until 2008, and only in response to the recognition of Kosovo's independence by several Western countries. Soon, Russia used South Ossetia to launch a direct attack on Georgia. It's a well-known story that involved the same kind of talk about genocide,
genocide,
and peace enforcement.
Принуждение к миру.
In the same way, Russia used the so-called DPR and LPR to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. But let's focus on the creation of those pseudo-republics.
Unlike the case of Transnistria, where the left bank of the Dniester has a distinct history, or those of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which were autonomous regions within the Georgian SSR, the emergence of separatism in eastern Ukraine was hardly based on objective preconditions. Russia manufactured it almost out of thin air, leveraging the same propaganda narratives. Ukrainian pro-Russian politicians, particularly Viktor Yanukovych and his associates, played a significant role in this by actively creating an image of an external enemy for residents of the Donbas in the form of other regions of Ukraine.
Що треба було Януковичу, щоб прийти до влади? Йому треба було переконати мешканців Донбасу, що на заході України живуть люди, які їм бажають зла. Це вороги, фашисти, нацисти. І проти них треба об'єднатися. Тому Донбас під загрозою, тому мешканці Донбасу мають прийти проголосувати за Януковича. Він захистить Донбас від фашистів, нацистів з Львова, з Луцька, Чернівців і так далі.
The seeds were planted long before 2014. In the cases of Moldova and Georgia, the catalyst for this type of propaganda was the gradual collapse of the USSR and the loosening of the Kremlin's control over these countries. In Ukraine, it was the departure from a political course that was committed to Russia. The propaganda campaign reached its first peak in 2004, when Viktor Yanukovych first ran for president. His rival, Viktor Yushchenko, was portrayed as a fascist in the Yanukovych's native region of Donbas. Propaganda alleged that Yushchenko was going to divide Ukrainians. When the Orange Revolution erupted in Ukraine in response to attempts to rig the presidential elections in favor of Yanukovych, his supporters concocted a separatist project in Severodonetsk. This event mirrored a similar separatist congress, the Congress of Deputies of all levels, that took place in Transnistria in 1990. They even called it similarly, the Congress of People's Deputies and Deputies of Local Councils. The separatist movement in Severodonetsk proposed that if Viktor Yushchenko was recognized as the winner of the presidential election, the eastern and southern regions should secede from Ukraine.
Although Viktor Yushchenko eventually won the election, there was no secession. On the other hand, and despite Yushchenko's overt political tolerance, the myth of the terrible fascists threatening the Donbas did not vanish either, because Russia kept on fueling it.
На Донбасі людей накачували цими міфами про те, що бандерівці приїдуть, їх будуть там утискати, вбивати, забороняти російську мову. Це все постійно поширювалося з Росії.
This propaganda campaign re-emerged almost a decade later under similar circumstances. Once again, a revolution took place and power was slipping out of Yanukovych's hands. Pro-Russian politicians began stirring up the situation in Donbas. After Yanukovych fled the country and the government changed, open pro-Russian rallies started in the region. Pro-Ukrainian rallies, which were also numerous at first, were quickly dispersed by force. Unlike in 2004, the situation worsened. In the regional centers, the cities of Donetsk and Luhansk, the so-called People's Republics were announced. The Donetsk People's Republic DPR and the Luhansk People's Republic LPR. In response to Kyiv's attempts to restore order, Russia decided to reenact the military scenario that had been tested in Moldova and Georgia.
ДНР цілком і повністю створювалася руками Російської Федерації, російських громадян. Без участі Росії вона б не виникла. Військовий конфлікт розпочав громадянин Росії Ігор Гіркін, стрілков, який вторгся зі своїм озброєним загоном 12 квітня 2014 року з території Росії в Донецьку область. Він захопив Слов'янськ, розпочав бойові дії. Це безпосередньо з цього почалася саме війна.
Yes, the same Russian citizen Igor Girkin, who had once defended Transnistria, played a key role in the outbreak of the war in the Donbas. He openly acknowledges his role in interviews. For example, in November 2014, he said, "I was the one who pulled the trigger on the war. If our unit hadn't crossed the border, it would have been the same as in Kharkiv and Odessa. There would have been a few dozen people killed, burned and arrested, and that would have been the end of it. But our unit actually started the engine of the war that is still going on."
Это мои слова, я их сказал Пороханову еще в 2014 году, да, и в принципе в них содержится правда.
The scenario practiced on the left bank of the Dniester and in Georgia was often applied verbatim in the Donbas. For example, units of Russian Cossacks and volunteers, Russian soldiers on leave, began to appear in the Donbas. Russia actively supplied them with weapons and equipment. It was a Russian Buk missile system that shut down the MH17 passenger plane in July 2014. Recently, the head of the Wagner PMC, Yevgeny Prigozhin, admitted that he created his private military company primarily for the fighting in the Donbas. I, like many other businessmen, went to the training grounds where the Cossacks were gathering and tried to waste money to assemble a group that would go and defend the Russians. From that moment, on May 1st, 2014, a group of patriots was born, which was later named the Wagner Battalion. Eventually, the regular Russian army was also directly involved in the fighting. There is a significant amount of information available, in particular about the participation of Russian soldiers in the battles for Ilovaisk in August 2014. As for the political aspect of the creation of the pseudo-republics, it is a complete déjà vu on the past events in Transnistria, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Russian citizens played a key role in the establishment and continued support of these separatist entities.
Голова уряду ЛНР – це був Марат Баширов. Це російський політтехнолог. І він фактично був як смотрящий, я не знаю, як це перекласти на іншу мову. Коротше, типу, той, хто насправді там від Росії керував цією всією історією. Політична частина ДНР створювалася громадянином Росії Олександром Бородаєм. Він приїхав в Донецьк і створив так званий уряд ДНР. Його не існувало там, да, тобто він створив цю саму організацію ДНР як політичну.
Remarkably, this Alexander Borodai also explicitly admitted that without Russia there would have been no Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics.
Я хочу сказать, что мы конкретно такому человеку, как президент Российской Федерации Владимир Путин, несколько должны. И если бы не его политика, не его решения и действия, то нас бы не было. Так же, как и не было бы русского Донбасса, Донецкой и Луганской народных республик.
The scenarios continued to repeat themselves. Just as in Moldova and Georgia, the armed conflict was more or less frozen by interstate agreements involving Russia. Similarly, Russia continued to use the pseudo-republics in Donbas as a tool to exert political pressure on Ukraine. Just as in Georgia, the pseudo-republics were eventually used as a springboard for a further military offensive, also accompanied by propaganda about genocide.
Необходимо было немедленно прекратить этот кошмар, геноцид в отношении проживающих там миллионов людей, которые надеются только на Россию.
Just as with the left bank of the Dniester, the myth that the region feeds the whole country and will become an economic paradise if left alone did not work.
Відбувся повний занепад, частина населення втекла, більше мільйона людей просто виїхали, тому що не залишилося для них роботи, і умови життя стали неможливими.
The socio-political situation in Donbas, even before the outbreak of the full-scale war, was dire. Denis Kazansky says that there were simply no elections as such, and not just elections.
Нема свободи зібрань, тобто не можна виходити на мітинги недозволені, немає свободи преси, свободи слова. Забрали все. Безправ'я, оці тортури, підвали, тобто той, хто в чимось незадоволений, він потрапляв на підвал. Там, да? І ця територія, оскільки це сіра зона, це територія повного беззаконня, де в тебе не було жодних взагалі шансів якось оскаржити.
However, one dream did come true. Russia has been handing out passports in the so-called PMR, but has not granted it recognition or accession. Abkhazia and South Ossetia were also honored with Russian passports, but had to wait for the official recognition for a decade and a half, and South Ossetia, despite all its aspiration, still remains an ostensibly separate entity from Russia. The DPR and the LPR, on the other hand, have not only received a rain of Russian passports, but have also been granted recognition and accession in 2022, in just 8 years. Their older sisters have much to be jealous of. Anyway, this is not the typical outcome of the Russian pseudo-republican scenario. The typical outcome is systemic ruin, political isolation, economic decline, and total dependence on Russia in all matters. And Russia needs this scenario not to help and support the enslaved and the oppressed, but to destabilize the international order. This is one of the standard models Russia uses to sow chaos, both in its own neighborhood and further abroad. To name but a few, Russia also supports different conspiracy theorists, populists, radicals, ranging from anti-vaxxers to Trumpists in the US, France, Serbia, the Czech Republic, well, almost anywhere. Considering Russia's global sphere of interest, stability of countries far beyond the former Soviet Union may ultimately depend on the world's ability to recognize the Russian pseudo-republican travesty early on, instead of pretending that it's not obvious.